Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do a tutorial in Lightroom on how I like to edit my photos. Now, this is just kind of like a very general process, and I don't think I've really done one of these videos before specifically for Lightroom. I don't always do coloring and editing in Lightroom. It's only on sort of select occasions. Most of my coloring is done in Photoshop, and that's probably why I've got a lot more Photoshop tutorials. But I do use Lightroom a lot for my workflow, and I do use it for coloring from time to time. So I thought I'd do a bit of a process tutorial today on how I like to go about using Lightroom to color my portraits and to edit. Now, regardless for skin editing, I always use Photoshop. I never ever use Lightroom for skin editing. That's just because I like the processes that you can use in Photoshop for that. So I've got plenty of skin retouching tutorials on my YouTube channel for you guys to go and check out, and I'll link a couple of them down below. For now, I'm just going to show you guys how I get straight into it with editing my photos in Lightroom. So first off, I like to have a rating process. Now, I will maybe do another video on this if you guys are interested in just my process of rating, going through photos, and how I kind of narrow down my shots. But as you can see, this one here is rated 5-star. So I am going to work on this photo for today. So most of this tutorial will be done in the Develop tab just up here in Lightroom. So I'm going to click on that. And this is where we get into editing the photo. So what I like to do pretty much straight off is just play around with some of the sliders. And this will take me a while. I usually like to create a preset with whatever I do, just in case I want to use it again down the track, or if it looks really good on the photo in particular, I can use it on most other photos in the series that I'm doing, or the editorial that I'm doing, or whatever it might be. So once I've clicked on the Develop tab, I'm ready to edit. And funnily enough, usually if I'm editing through Photoshop for toning, I'll usually do skin editing first. And I don't know why this is, it's just always the process that I've used. I'll do skin editing first and then go on to coloring the image. For Lightroom, I do it the opposite way around. I think it just works easier with the workflow, and I'm not going to get into it too much because I'll probably do another video on workflow like I said before, so we might do something like that if you guys are interested in seeing that. And I'll show you guys how I like to do my whole workflow through Lightroom. But for now, I'm just going to show you guys what I like to do first off with the image. So I usually try and organize the lighting first. So this will be any contrast, highlights, shadows, anything like that. I usually like to have quite contrasted images, in a sense, but then I'll use some other sliders to kind of tweak it a bit. So I usually put my contrast right up to around, say, 25. And then I'll move on to the highlights and shadows, whites and blacks. Now, I do tend to underexpose my photos a little bit when I'm shooting, so maybe 1 to 2 stops on average. And it's just something I've always done when I've photographed, and I like the tone that it kind of gives me and the colors that it kind of gives me as well in camera. So sometimes I tend to go a little bit overboard with this. That's where the shadows and the blacks come in on the sliders here. So usually I'll move the shadows up a little bit to compensate for my underexposing. As you can see, Stephanie's shirt is quite dark here, so we're going to move the shadows up a bit. And we're also going to move the whites down a little bit just to soften, because it's a little bit too bright in some areas of that photo. So we'll just move that down a bit. And then the blacks we're also going to move up a little bit as well, just to brighten up some of these areas down here and some of the shadows in the shot. And now we're going to work on clarity as well. Clarity is one of my favorite tools in Lightroom because I really feel like it does a great job of emphasizing certain parts of the image, and it's kind of like sharpening, but not sharpening in a sense. So it's really one of my favorite tools. I always like to move that up a little bit. We'll just move it down a little bit to 18. And I also tweak the vibrance slider because I usually go a little bit overboard with editing in terms of coloring sometimes. So I already know I'm going to go overboard with that. So we'll just bring that down a little bit just to cut down the vibrance a little bit. There we go. And now we'll move on to tone curve. Now, tone curve is very similar to how I use curves in Photoshop, and it will have certain channels that you work with. So first off, we're going to start in the RGB. This is going to tweak the lighting even further, but I'm not going to do too much with this because I've already tweaked the lighting. So we're just going to get a little bit more of a tone in the image and leave it at that. I usually like to have a bit of an S-curve going, as you guys might know from watching some of my other tutorials. This is mainly in the RGB field, just kind of gives a nice effect. So I'm going to just move this up a little bit on the end, and that's up the shadows a little bit. So obviously we're losing some of that contrast at the beginning. That's why I wanted to make sure there was a bit more contrast in it, because I do tend to go into these tools as well and play around a little bit further. I never tend to get coloring or lighting right on the first go. That's why I make so many adjustments, because I'm really doing everything as I go along, unless I've already saved something as a preset. And we'll move this point down a little bit. And then we'll move another point in here and leave the last one at 100%. So that's kind of the S-curve that we've made here, and it's just kind of given the image a little bit more contrast back, but still lifting up the blacks a little bit to give it that kind of faded retro effect. So I'm going to continue playing around with the channels here. So we'll go into the red channel, and we'll just continue making a few adjustments here until I get something that I kind of like. And then put in another point here. And then leave the last one at 100. So we've got a little bit of an S-curve going again, but it's kind of like in the opposite direction for the reds. And then we'll go into the greens and make a few points here. And then up here again. These are kind of the points that I like to work with most. I usually make 2 extra points in a tone curve, sometimes more, sometimes less. Okay, so I think the green channel is good, and then we'll go into the blues this time. And we're going to move the blues and the shadows up a little bit. Usually like to do this. Might add a couple of points in here. And then another one up here. And then we'll just move the highlight tone curve a little bit this way. Awesome. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks at the moment. If you just turn this on and off, you can see how that looks on the image, and I'm pretty happy with how that has been applied there. So now I'm going to move on from tone curve. I think I'm pretty happy with that now. I might always go back and do some extra tweaking, just depending on how the coloring goes, but you know, like I said, a lot of the time I don't get it right straight off, so I do happen to do that quite a bit. But we're going to move on to split toning now. So what I like to do with split toning is to change the highlights and the shadows a little bit more and tweak that. So the highlights, a lot of the time I will give it slightly, if I give it a cooler tone on the highlight, I might give a warmer tone in the shadows and vice versa. So I think I'm going to go for a little bit more of a warmer tone in the highlights, because I do have quite a bit of cool tone everywhere else in the image. I'm going to move the hue over to the warmer areas of the hue here. And I'm going to up the saturation just to see how that looks. So I'll move it up to about 6. I don't want it too saturated. So you can see that's made a little bit of a difference in the highlights. Now the shadows, I'm going to give a bit more of a cooler effect again. So I'm going to move the saturation up this time first, just a little bit more so I can see it, what I'm doing. And then move that over to the blues. So around there, I might just up that saturation just a little bit more. So you guys can see just by adding that split toning, how much of a difference that can make again on top of the tone curve in coloring. So that's all I like to do with split toning. You know, sometimes I might have a bit more of an experimental phase there, but I actually really like how this is coming out at the moment. So all I'm going to do now is go down to sharpening. And I usually just like to move sharpening up a little bit more to around this area, just so I can sharpen the image overall. Usually I do this a different way in Photoshop, but for now I'm just going to show you guys how to do that there. So what I do now, guys, at this point is move this photo into Photoshop for any skin retouching. Now how I would usually do that is by right-clicking the photo, edit in, and then Photoshop, and then you would render using Lightroom. I have already edited this photo, so I'm going to show you guys what that looks like now with the skin editing. And I'm not going to go through a tutorial on skin editing because, like I said, I've got so many tutorials already on my YouTube channel. And this tutorial is mainly for Lightroom color editing. So I'm going to show you guys now what the finished product looks like. Okay, so this is the final edit, and this is with the coloring and how I would usually edit in Lightroom. Now, like I said, I don't always use Lightroom for editing, and especially because I just prefer to do my skin editing first, and I usually like retouching through Photoshop first and then doing my coloring. But this technique's really good if you need to bulk edit a lot of images, whether it be for a wedding or a family shoot or something like that, a couple shoot. It's a really handy technique to use, or even if you've just got a heap of images for whatever reason that you do need to edit, this is a really good way to do it through Lightroom. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you learn a few points throughout the video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. For those of you who don't know, I am traveling quite a bit at the moment, and I am also travel vlogging with my boyfriend Dan. We've got our own channel called Wanderwalkers. If you'd like to keep up with our adventures there, you can do that, and the link for that is down below in the description box. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!